Croeso, Difda, Benachtin, Gia Hwitch, Fulcha, Daymat. Welcome to the Celtic Myths and Legends podcast. I am your humble host, Sian Esther Powell, and I'm going to be taking you on a journey through all the myths and legends of the 6 Celtic nations. That's Wales, Cornwall, Brittany, Isle of Man, Scotland and Ireland. Welcome. So welcome Difda. We are of course back to Cornwall, my homeland, back to fair Kerno. So this is going to be a fun one, do you know? Not that they're not all fun, but this one's going to be a really fun one because I am doing a whole new year, new me. I'm trying to make a lot more healthy choices in all areas of my life, and to some extent I am actually succeeding. So this episode is going to really be a little bit of a revamp of my very first episode, which was sort of introductions and the Cornish piskie. So would you believe people have actually come to see me give talks on Cornish piskies, or the Pobel Vean, the little folk of Cornwall, because there are in fact many different types of Cornish piskie. So I thought it would be really fun to kind of, with hope, forge onwards with this podcast and just, show you that I'm continuing it. I want to continue it for as long as possible. I'm still having fun with it. But it's about time that I did a revamp of that very first episode and just gave you a bit more of a general overview about all of the Pobel Vean, the little folk of Cornwall. So, that's what this episode's going to be about. You're going to hear about all of the different types of Cornish piskies. And there are many of them. This is going to be a good one for me. It's 10 o'clock now and I have a very strict bedtime routine now. So I like to read before bed and then go bed. So I'm reading, I'm still on Discworld at the moment, but I'm now on Mort. So I'm now reading Mort, which is really good fun. So my motivation is to get through this episode, have fun, and then, do my skincare routine and then read Mort and then go to bed feeling fulfilled, feeling happy, feeling accomplished. So let me just launch right into it, my lovely friends. Oh, but before I do, because I live in tangents, I have incredibly exciting news that I will mention at the end of the episode. So please stay tuned for the whole thing, because at the end of the episode I've got a really cool surprise, some really amazing, fantastic news. A couple really cool things, and they are directly related to this episode and the topic of this episode. So really, they're tangents, but they're not really. They're all related. Everything's related in this episode, okay? So lots of cool news, and it's all Cornish piskie related in one way or another. So shall we just crack on? So what is the kind of relevance of Cornish piskies in today's world, okay? You probably have your preconceived notions of what a Cornish piskie is. You might have watched Harry Potter. You might have listened to my very first, very brief episode on the topic. Now, I'm pretty bad at just assuming that everyone knows everything that I talk about. So I'm not going to do that in this podcast. I'm going to give you a really good overview of all of the different types of Cornish piskies, and I'm going to try to not leave anything else out. So, outside of mermaids and giants, Cornish piskies are the kind of iconic creature of Cornish folklore and the pop culture surrounding Cornwall. So, you'll know that I like to talk about pop culture whenever it pops up. So, you've got the band Pixies. You've got, we know what pixies are. Pixies are in general kind of understanding. They're one of those kind of folkloric creatures that we all know about, even those of us that are not interested in folklore or anything at all. We know what pixies are, okay? But it's Cornish piskies. Thank you very much. Be careful how you say that. But you'd have little piskie charms, there's loads of stories about Cornish piskies. So I think there is that sort of pop culture understanding of the pixie, but let's delve into what the Cornish piskie actually is, because I think they make a really interesting parallel to Cornwall itself. Okay, so a few things about Cornwall. Of course, it is a Celtic nation. That's what this whole podcast is about, is that each episode I pick one of the 6 Celtic nations and I delve a little bit deeper into their folklore. So Pobel Vean is, of course, the Cornish language. It's Cornish language for little folk. Now, there's lots of different types of these Cornish piskies. Now, outside of being a Celtic nation, Cornwall does have, very strong cultural and linguistic differences to the rest of England. So Cornwall is in England, geographically, politically, what have you, but it does have that linguistic difference, hence it still being considered a Celtic nation, but it has a lot of cultural kind of differences as well. So Cornwall as a sea peninsula, we're also incredibly minerally rich. All of these factors, that the kind of language of Cornwall, the culture, the geology, the industry of Cornwall. Now, I take it for granted that everyone knows that Cornwall is an incredibly industrial place, right? Mining has been happening in Cornwall since way before the Industrial Revolution. We are perhaps one of the most culturally one of the most sort of minerally diverse and minerally rich areas in the whole world, right? Cornish miners are intrinsic to a sort of sense of Cornish identity, and a lot of people with Cornish heritage, like the Cornish diaspora in America, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Portugal, all of these places where Cornish miners went to, let's be fair, like colonise places really, in aid in that sort of colonisation. But all of these places where miners were needed, you would find Cornishmen there. So a mine is just a hole with a Cornishman at the bottom of it. That's a pretty well-known saying here. So mining is very intrinsic to Cornish identity, and I'll kind of talk about the diaspora a little bit later. That's directly relevant to what I'm talking about today. But all I'm saying is that all of these factors, the language, the culture, the geology, the geography, the landscape, the industry of Cornwall, they've all formed in a way to create an identity that is very kind of distinct and undeniably Cornish. So I'm from Cornwall, born and bred here. It's very close to my heart to kind of, share and rave about the wonderful place that it is. So, the Cornwall that people are aware of is usually one that's quite sunny blue skies, quaint fishing villages, pasties and ice cream. I love all of those things as much as the next person. But this kind of picture postcard friendly version of Cornwall that is used by advertisement agencies. It's not the real Cornwall. The real Cornwall is something it's a bit darker, it's a bit more gothic underneath. And I find that the same with the Cornish piskie, hence my sort of why I think it's a good parallel for the whole of Cornwall, a really good symbol for the whole of Cornwall, is that on the surface, it's a very cheeky piece of, I've just punched the microphone there, so if you heard a horrible noise, I'm very sorry. My hand brushed against it. I don't think I should get into like ASMR. I'm doing it now. I'm like brushing my hands on the mic. That probably sounds horrible. I'm going to stop it. But anyway, piskies have this kind of, they're very cheeky piece of iconography, and they're found in tourist gift shops, and they're a little bit of fun. They're a little bit silly. But actually, if you scratch the surface of the piskie myth and of this piece of iconography, there's something much more interesting, much more complex and much darker underneath. So like the whole of Cornwall, really. Now, I've said it once, I have said it again. Folklore is a completely underrated historical and sociological tool, to understand people, to understand a people. So, you can use it, you can use folklore and storytelling to tell like very interesting things about people, but you can also read it and understand interesting things about people at the time. So piskies, they're links to peasant superstition and otherness of the Cornish people and landscape tell us that up until very recently, I did my initial degree in ancient history. So when I talk about recent, I'm talking about like, a few hundred years. In my brain, that's recent. But up until this sort of like very recently, Cornwall was still seen as a very distinct place. It was seen as a very peculiar Gothic place, you know, in its strange belief in the old ways. It wasn't a tourist destination, really. It was a little bit, you know, it was, but it did have that sort of Gothic edge to it as well. You know, it was very much disconnected from the rest of England. So piskies today, they're little trinkets, they're little tourist curios, but they do betray that other side of Cornwall, that distinctness, which is now a bit of a shadow. It's a bit of a memory. Now, there's a really, really great quote that I will include later on in the podcast that I think encapsulates this sort of this kind of tragic idea, actually, of our folklore fading in Cornwall, these stories of piskies fading in Cornwall, and that kind of being a parallel for Cornwall itself, actually, in our kind of heritage and identity kind of fading away in a little bit. But let's not get too crazy, because folklore also shouldn't be taken too seriously. You know, these are stories. Yes, you can use them to talk about quite hard-hitting things, but they are stories at the end of the day, and stories change and they evolve continuously depending on who the storyteller is and who the audience is. So if you're talking to children, your stories of piskies might be like a little bit different. So, you know, before written records, a lot of these stories were passed around in an oral fashion. Droll tellers would visit different towns in Cornwall, going from town to town, sharing news, sharing gossip, but also sharing these stories of quite mythological creatures. So we can't assume that the first written records are the beginnings of these stories, or that there are ever, one correct version of these stories, because there just isn't. Now, I'm going to talk to you about Cornish piskies because, like I said, they to me are an iconic bit of Cornish mythology, and they're a very great symbol for Cornwall. So, you know, they're cute and they're fun, but there's something darker about them as well. So let's begin by talking about the iconic Cornish piskie. No, they're not blue, and they're not like a few inches tall and winged. They're not like they are in Harry Potter at all in the myths and legends. But like I said, there is no correct one, is there? It's open to interpretation. Stories evolve, they change. But in all the different sources, they're usually about sort of like 3 foot tall in kind of sometimes in red cap, sometimes in green clothes, sometimes just in normal raggedy clothes. So you'd often find this sort of, I say standard as if they're boring. They're not boring, they're great. But we're talking about the piskies that roam on the misty moors, places like Bodmin, West Penwith, and possibly before the China clay industry, St Austell, which was all moorland. Now, these are the piskies that like to dance merrily betwixt standing stones and in the middle of stone circles. These piskies are, say it with me, my friends, capricious. These piskies are capricious. That is something that you have heard me say time and time again, and I will continue to say it. It's a word that I like, and I am just, I'm sticking to it. So, the piskies on the moors, these are the types of piskies that would lead you astray. So, to be piskie-led is when you get hopelessly lost. And of course, that is exactly what it sounds like. It is, in the folklore, it is piskies leading you astray. So let me give you a couple of survival tips so you can avoid being piskie-led yourself. Now, the first one is you can carry a bit of salt in your pocket, or you can turn your jacket or whatever garment you've got on, a sock, inside out. A glove would be good. I think gloves would be the most convenient. So if you can just walk around with gloves, even in like the heart of summer, have a garment that's easy to sort of turn around. Because if you turn a piece of clothing inside out, I'm not sure what the reason is. Maybe piskies think that if you turn clothes inside out, you are absolutely mental and you are not worth bothering with. But they will stop bothering with you, and it's a surefire way to ensure that you stop being piskie-led. So if you ever find yourself on a walk on the moors, being hopelessly lost, and it might even feel a bit purposeful, who is leading you astray? Spoiler alert, it's the piskies. Turn an item of your clothing inside out, and that should hopefully help you. Now, another one is, that's what I said, isn't it? It's the salt in your pocket, or you can just walk around with, a nice pouch of salt. I'm not sure what you're supposed to do with the salt, whether you're supposed to throw it at them, or whether you're supposed to eat it menacingly, or what you're supposed to do with the salt, who knows. But a little bit like in a lot of folklore, fairies don't like iron. Well, piskies don't like salt. I don't know why that is, but they don't. So those are my 2 survival tips for you to ensure that you're not being piskie led on the moors, is carry a bit of salt and turn your piece of clothing inside out. So let's imagine it's a cold, misty day and you are walking alone on Bodmin Moor. Suddenly, what's that you hear? Dancing and merriment in the distance. Now, you've probably had a little tipple, little bit to drink. You're probably walking home from the pub, let's be fair. And it sounds like the people over there are having a very good time, and you want to carry on the party, don't you? You want to carry on having a good time. So you move towards the dancing, towards the singing, towards the merriment, and what do you come across? A bunch of piskies dancing in a stone circle. Now, what are these piskies? Are they a separate race of man? Are they a separate race distinct from man? Are they symbols of the old pagans of Cornwall who were once great giants, and now, year after year, belief in them diminishes, belief in the old ways diminishes, and the old gods and the old stories, and they become smaller and smaller and smaller? This seems to be something that Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett like a lot, this idea that with diminishing belief, so too do gods and, creatures diminish and fade. So obviously I'm not going to kind of go in too much of a tangent and talk about other creatures of Cornwall, because this is very much about the Pobel, Vean, the little folk. But as I mentioned in my Giants of Cornwall episode, there was a belief that giants kind of represented paganism in Cornwall, and some of the folklorists have this idea that giants, they represented the pagans of Cornwall, and some could swell in different size. So I find it really interesting that that's also connected to piskies, this idea that they are symbols of the pagans of Cornwall, the pre-Christian populations of Cornwall. So it's interesting to kind of put those 2 things together, actually, piskies and giants, and this idea of maybe they were giants once and now they've gone smaller and smaller and smaller. So piskies in sources of around 200 years ago, they're said to be 3 foot tall in raggedy clothes. And maybe that explains why we don't see piskies that much anymore. They've become smaller and smaller and smaller until they've remained hidden out of sight. Maybe they're like little ant size now, who knows. But let's imagine you come across these piskies on the moor, dancing and having lots of fun. You can't quite believe your eyes. You've heard the stories, you've heard the stories from your grandmother, your mother, me, your friend Sean. They've told you about the piskie folk that you can sometimes see dancing away, and you're not sure whether to be frightened, whether to be in awe. So you walk towards them and you join the dancing troupe, and you dance and you dance and you dance, and no one ever sees you again. Happy ending. So is Cornwall the only region with belief in piskies? As you might have caught on, I have been pronouncing it piskie and not necessarily pixie. Now, pixie is the version you have probably heard, and pixies belong in the folklore of Cornwall and Devon and Somerset, and probably around. There's also other variations like pigsy, like Pigsies, and other regional variations. Now, there's also these ideas that there'll be battles between these different factions of piskies. So much like the modern Cornishman and Devonian, we have our little battles. So too, I expected the piskies of Cornwall and the pixies or pigsies of Devon and Somerset. I love this idea of like big fairy piskie battles. It cracks me up. Now, what is interesting about piskies as well is they're not just flesh and blood creatures. The further back you go, the more incorporeal they become. In some folklore, they're sort of like ghosts or spirits or something else in between, some kind of transcendental being, like existing in a liminal space between the sort of flesh and blood and between spirit. It was quite interesting, really, that they do tend to be connected to like magic in that sort of way. So humans interacting with piskies, you've got a lot of history on witchcraft in Cornwall. I probably should do a whole episode on Cornish witchcraft, and I will, and that will come up quite a lot actually, as Cornish witches and their sort of interactions and relationship to the piskies. Now, there's lots of folk customs pertaining to these types of piskies. You can leave them gifts of clothing, of fine fabrics. They're often said to be dressed in rags and can look quite scruffy and impoverished. So actually, Dobby, the house elf, is a little bit more similar to Cornish piskies, what they would be like in most of the historic folklore. Actually, yeah, it's the elves in Harry Potter that are a bit more similar. But they're usually, like I said, dressed in rags and scruffy and impoverished. And when you give them a gift of clothing, it means they can bugger off. So if you've got a piskie working on your... Because sometimes they did help out. Sometimes they would help you out in the house. Sometimes they would help you out on the land. And if you did have a piskie helping you out, on your farm, if you gave him a brand new scarf, a new sock, he's buggering off and he's leaving you high and dry. So, it's a moral dilemma, isn't it? It's like, be a good person and reward and look after, and then they'll piss off, or excuse my language, or keep them downtrodden and keep them forever. My morals win out on this one. I think give them the new clothes and let them go on to greener pastures. And there's also this idea of leaving, dishes of the creamiest milk and water out for piskies, which is sort of like very similar to English hobs and fairies and spirits. So this is something that's very similar in folklore from a lot of... certainly a lot of European countries, but actually I would say this is probably very similar to stories about other folk or kind of fairy type creatures in basically all of the cultures of the world. We probably have this idea of gift giving and that kind of reciprocal thing, really, which is quite interesting. Like I said, I say it repeatedly, but I'm always really interested in the similarities between cultures and how the same types of stories kind of pop up again and again. Now, that lovely quote that I was going to mention earlier, it's by Samuel Drew, and it's his 1824 book. The age of piskies, like that of chivalry, is gone. There is perhaps at present hardly a house they are reputed to visit. Even the fields and lanes they formerly frequented seem to be nearly forsaken. Their music is rarely heard. Now that makes me really sad. That does make me really sad. But those are the sort of, those are the standard Cornish piskie, if you will. And, piskies feature quite a lot in the terminology of Cornwall. I remember once, even my grandfather, who's a farmer right on the outskirts of like Brownwilly and Routor, like right in North Cornwall, in a real rugged, rural bit of North Cornwall that feels very ancient. It's like the stones have like soaked up all of this like ancient energy. It's a really lovely place up there. The landscape is absolutely incredible, and it has a lot of like old-fashioned ways and but yeah, he was telling me all these old-fashioned ways of being able to tell if you're going to get lost, like following animal tracks, because animals know where the swampy ground is, so you follow the tracks and you won't end up stuck. So another way to avoid being piskie-led, follow the animal tracks. But he was telling me, you can lick your finger and hold it up to the wind, and it will show you like which direction the wind is blowing in, north, south, east, west, acting as a sort of weather vane. But I remember him telling me these things, and he did use the terminology piskie-led. So, I don't think he's all that interested in fairies and sprites and that kind of thing. But he did say, to avoid being piskie-led, whether he was saying it for my benefit, which he might well have been. He knows how much I love this type of stuff. But, he said to avoid being piskie-led. Those were his sort of guides not to get piskie-led on the moors. So it is something that folklore finds a nice, interesting way of seeping into our kind of everyday speech and some of the things we believe in, whether or not we even know the root of some of these stories. Now, think. So it's like, folklore in this instance, it can be embedded in the common phrases of a region without the belief in them anymore necessarily, but the terminology is still there as a shorthand for the types of situations and phenomena that used to be associated with people, that people in the past found themselves in. Now, that kind of brings me very much perfectly on to our next Pobel Vean, the Cornish knockers. Now, these are particularly interesting in terms of diaspora, but I'll get onto that in a little bit. Now, this might sound familiar as a piece of folklore, and I'll explain why, really. Knockers, much like the Welsh cobbler nigh and kobolds found in like German folklore and stuff like that. They're like small, wizened, old-looking creatures, and they're said to be about 2-3 foot tall, wearing old mining garb and carrying little pickaxes and a little lantern. And they were piskie-like creatures that lived underground and were often found in tin mines. So they were very useful to miners. They're not necessarily evil or malevolent. There are some stories of them getting a bit angry, and I'll mention one in a bit later. But for the most part, the knockers were quite benevolent. They were good. They were goodies. They were quite benevolent. You know what I'm trying to say. It is now 10:25. I've got to hurry myself up. I've got to get reading me mort. Got to get reading me book. Got to go to bed. Brush me teeth. But they were pretty good, right? They're not associated with being like nasty little buggers, really. They can be mischievous, but there's a real lovely, strong element of mutual respect when it comes to the Cornish knockers. So that really stems down from the miners themselves treating them with respect. So every self-respecting Cornishman's got to have himself a pasty for crib for his lunchtime, isn't he? Now, those of you know what a pasty is. It's a sort of handheld pastry with a crust. So miners would have been holding that crust, and of course it would have been absolutely filthy from their hands. So that's the reason that the crust existed to begin with, so miners could probably hold it. But in the folklore, you would chuck the crust for the knockers. So yeah, you would chuck the crust away and give it to the knockers, and that would be their sort of lunch in a way. It's that idea of giving something and getting something in return. And I don't know whether or not that's some old hidden morality in folklore, like some old hospitality morality tales, what have you, but it's really interesting to kind of view it through that. I wouldn't be surprised if there is some moral coding in some of these stories, but that's essentially it. You treat the knockers well, they'll look after you. So what they can do is they can knock like this, quite a steady knock, and if you follow that, you can get to the best ore. So they would show you the best veins to kind of mine from. But the more frantic knocking, that is when you should start to worry. That's when they're telling you a mine is about to collapse in. So they're telling you, get gone, get out of here, my friend. So that's why I say they're pretty benevolent. They're benevolent. They're benevolent. Okay, I just had to make up for all of my stumbles out. Benevolent. They're very benevolent. They're pretty good. So they will help you out because there has been that mutual respect, because, you've given a bit of your lunch aside for them, because there's that consideration of them that they will help you. Now, there is a particular story of a young chap who obviously had bought into this kind of romanticization of mining, and he was thinking, I can't wait to go down the mines like me dad, like me older brothers. That means I'm going to be a man. But of course, once he got there, he realised mines are bloody cold. They're bloody cold, and they're hard work, and they're dark, and they're dingy, and they ain't all that comfortable. So he had his pasty for lunch, and he ate it all up, didn't leave any crust for the knockers. No. And he saw a colleague of his stuff a bit of the crust in a nook little cranny in the mine, and he thought, I'm still quite hungry, it's my first shift, but I'm still quite hungry. I'm going to pinch the rest of his food. But no, you silly boy, silly boy, because of course, you've probably guessed it, that was supposed to be the knocker's lunch. So the knocker is not altogether all that happy that he's stolen his food. And then, of course, when the mine is about to collapse in, which I think is awfully convenient, I think it's much more likely the knocker has collapsed the mine himself, really, out of anger. But there just so happened to be the mine collapsing in at this very moment in that very location. And the knocker didn't do anything to bloody help that boy, did he? Poor lad. But don't go eating gifts for the piskies. It is not, it's not very good. So like I said, Cornwall is minerally rich. So we had the expertise of mining here. We had a lot of the engineering around mining, and we had the actual miners, the skills set to do it. So Cornish miners left kind of en masse for places like America, Australia, Mexico, Portugal, and all of these other places, New Zealand. Everywhere that had mines, you would find Cornish miners. And because of this, the Cornish and Welsh miners, taking their stories of the knockers, of the Pobel, they ended up in America, and we get the American folklore of the Tommy knocker, which is directly from Cornish and arguably a bit of Welsh folklore as well. I think this is so cool. I love this idea of travelling folklore, because folklore is the stories and beliefs told by people. Where people go, the stories follow. There's a really great example of travelling folklore in Neil Gaiman's American Gods. Now, I'm sure I've talked about a lot of the things I've mentioned in this episode. I think I've probably talked about before, but like I said, we're revisiting. I'm going through the world happier, healthier, and I'm trying to do the same with this podcast. Let's make sure it still stays relevant. We kind of update information and keep it fun as we go. But Neil Gaiman's American Gods, you have that idea of people emigrating to or forced into America, bringing their stories and bringing their folklore with them. So also in American Gods, there's an 18th century Cornish peasant girl who becomes an indentured servant sent to America for being a thief, a prostitute, a con artist, amongst other things. So in the TV series, she was Irish. But I think she's Cornish in the book. I might have just been... Please tell me if I'm imagining that, because yeah, she's Irish in the show, but I'm sure in the book she's Cornish. And she brings the story of Cornish piskies with her. She kind of attributes her good luck in not getting caught to the piskies, who she routinely leaves out like dishes of milk, and has a deep kind of genuine belief in, a real superstition of, and a respect for. Now, she's eventually caught out, but due to her being pregnant, manages to escape hanging. In America, she eventually marries a widowed father and raises his children, and has a child of their own together. And she shares the story of the piskies. She teaches them about the piskies and other myths and legends of Cornwall. Like one day when she's an old lady, her husband is gone and her grandchildren are doing their own thing, a cousin Jack comes to take her away. Now, cousin Jack was a name for the Cornish diaspora. So was a name for the Cornish miners and Cornish people that left and went to other places of the world. You'd be called a cousin Jack. And a cousin Jack comes and takes her away, and I think he's supposed to be a piskie. But please let me know if I'm wrong. I'm sure it's Cornwall in the book, and it's not Ireland. But maybe American audiences wouldn't have known what Cornwall is, so preferred the Irish. I guess leprechauns are much more well known. Oh, there is I'm getting confused now. It's been a long time since I've read the book. But there we go. That's a really nice example of travelling folklore and folklore kind of moving with people, and that idea of the Tommy knocker. I absolutely love that idea of the Tommy knocker being a direct kind of evolution of the Cornish knocker. Now, like I said, the knockers would lead miners to the best ore veins, implying that these mining piskies are incredibly hardworking and industrious themselves. Like they're dressed up in little mining garb. They've got little pickaxes. They've got little lanterns. So they're workers as well, aren't they? According to Nancy Arrowsmith and George Morse's A Field Guide to the Little People, two things the knockers absolutely do not like are whistling and swearing. And they're said to go completely mad if they hear whistling. But laughing and singing is totally acceptable to them, and they tend to enjoy it. Now, singing's a big thing in Cornish culture. Now, I've recently started in a shanty band, but really it's we're a group that sing shanties, but we also sing a bunch of Cornish pub shout songs as well. So a pub shout in Cornwall is basically a pub sing song. Really, it's a bunch of people get together and they sing a well-known song, and then everyone joins in. So Cornwall, so singing is really kind of like intrinsic to Cornish identity. So I love the idea of like, miners singing their songs, and then the piskies are like the knockers are just like, loving it. I like to think the piskies on the moors would like to have a bit of sing-song as well. So I tend to do that quite a lot when I'm walking the dog. I do tend to walk around and have my own little sing-song. Now, the next lot of Pobel Vean that I'm going to talk to you about are spriggans. Now, spriggans are a really, really great example of folklore in pop culture as well. I've been saying spriggans for years, and actually recently I found out maybe it's supposed to be spriggan. So what do you prefer, spriggan or spriggan? Because apparently it comes from the Cornish sprision or sprision, meaning spirits. So these are the sort of more incorporeal type creatures. Now, spriggans are great because, like I said, they pop up in a lot of pop culture. So I'm not really sure how many people listening have played any of the Elder Scrolls games, but spriggans are quite nasty creatures found in those games, especially in Oblivion and in Skyrim. They're these beautiful kind of feminine, beautiful, fierce nature spirits, almost like walking trees, all roots and leaves, but in a very kind of feminine form. Now, this depiction, in my opinion, my theory is that this kind of this common depiction of them seems to be very much based on the Spriggan sculpture by Marilyn Collins that's found in Parkland Walk in Crouch End in London. Now, this shows how the artistic representations of folklore travel and are changed on and built on, and they influence further stories and pieces of art concerning these creatures and stories. So I personally want as many artists as possible to just be drawing creatures from myths and legends. So if you're an artist and you've ever been inspired by any of my episodes and you've ever drawn any of the creatures from them, thank you so much, because artistic interpretations of folklore are so hard to come by, and actually I think they really aid people nowadays in kind of envisioning the stories and really getting sucked up into them. So that is the version of the spriggan that you see in pop culture, the sort of feminine formed nature spirit, really. But in the folklore of Cornwall, they are completely different. The spriggan sculpture itself is more masculine looking, but it is very much that nature spirit with ivy and plants hanging around him as he like emerges from a wall. And he's quite cute. He's quite like cheeky looking, really. Which is just, it's just not what the folklore of Cornwall really represents. But again, I harken back to what I said before of there is no correct version. There is no right version of a lot of these stories. There's just different ways of sharing these stories. So I have never seen the sculpture in person, but it really is beautiful, and I do love it, and I've seen pictures of it, and I think it's lovely that a small piece of Cornish folklore has found its way up in London, and you can find Cornish folklore in all sorts of places. But the spriggan in Cornish folklore, a lot of sources, a lot of Borlays and all of these Cornish folklorists, the spriggan is usually said to be quite horrible, twisted, ugly, and with creepy like big childlike features, like big heads, big eyes, like big, but like, yeah, these great big heads, like with great big massive bulbous eyes, and but they're also got these quite twisted, warty, kind of ugly, horrible bodies. Bless them, I'm not being very nice to them, but there's a reason for that, and it's because Spriggans are not very nice themselves. They are in fact bloody horrible. They're really nasty buggers. Now, I'm not sure if this has anything to do with a very old-fashioned notion, very much favoured by the bloody Victorians, with the concept of, physiognomy and that of someone's physical appearance, most often their face, reflecting their character as either morally good or morally bad, depending on their attractiveness. I think this is a bloody horrible thing. I hate it. Really do not like it, but maybe that's where this idea comes from. The ugly monster equals bad, but beautiful hero equals good. This obviously predates the Victorians, but it's a horrible concept. You can have a lot of fun with it, but it obviously predates the Victorians, but not very nice. So they are objectively the ugliest of these Pobel Vean, and they are objectively the most evil. So really, Spriggans do not seem to have any kind of redeeming qualities. They're not capricious, they're just bad. They're just plain bad. They were said to be very protective of their worldly goods, their possessions, their treasure, their loot. It's all my shanty stuff now. I'm just obsessed with pirate treasure and loot. But they are particularly said to haunt old, abandoned, ruined buildings and cairns and barrows, guarding their treasure. Now, this act of haunting old ruins is very similar to the Anglo-Scottish red cap, that wonderful bit of folklore that exists on the border of England and Scotland. Have I done an episode on the red cap? No, I don't think I have. I will. They are creepy. They are scary. So look out for that. Possibly one of the nastiest fairies on all of Britain, really. Let's not get too much into them now, because I think I want to do a whole episode on them, but they also like to haunt old ruins. Now, you wouldn't want to come across them, and you would not want to come across a Spriggan. Robert Hunt states that they were the spirits of old giants. Now, this is what I said earlier, isn't it, really? Connecting piskies and giants, but Robert Hunt specifically kind of talks about Spriggans linked to giants and say they were the spirits of old giants, and although twisted, gnarled and small, they can swell to gigantic size, and they are incredibly strong. So they have this sort of like inherent magic. Because they can also conjure up great storms and whirlwinds against travellers and poor people led astray into their kind of regions. They are doing basically everything they can to keep people away from their treasure. They seem to be the villain in a lot of stories. They're blighting crops. If someone is robbed, or if a building collapses, or there's cattle stolen or children stolen away, usually a Spriggan would be blamed for something like that. So that kind of leads me quite naturally on to, so that's basically Spriggans. They're ugly and they're mean, and they conjure up storms, and they like to guard their buried treasure hidden in old abandoned buildings, and they could be the spirits of old giants, and they sometimes like to steal children away and leave ugly changelings in their place. So that does bring me on to changelings. Now, this idea of being stolen by the other folk, this is not unique to Cornwall. Changelings are found in all sorts of myths and legends. Any culture that's associated with piskies, fairies, other folk will have this story of changelings. So being stolen by the folk, being transported in time, or entering into kind of altered consciousness, whether that's by the landscape itself or by drugs or by alcohol. It's a common motif found in the stories of being piskie-led, and found in the folklore collections of Robert Hunt and William Bottrell, among others, that people often enter into a state of being totally, not just physically lost, but mentally changed. When you swap out a child or an adult and you bring a changeling in their place, if the person ever comes back, they're bewildered, they're frightened, they're not knowing left from right, up or down. This idea of being stolen into another land or place can be seen in a lot of the pop culture concerning the Celtic. Now, Outlander for a start. This idea of going through the stones and entering into another time. I'm a big Outlander fan. I'm gonna out myself there. No shame in it. Absolutely love it. This story of a World War II combat nurse who honeymoons in Scotland and magically finds herself transported back into 18th century Scotland, where she travels through a portal connected to standing stones. There's this great scene actually where she's listening to a folk singer in Gaelic and she's spellbound by it until she is given the English translation of I am a woman of Balnain, the folk have stolen me over again, which totally reflects her very strange and unique experience. And then from that moment onwards, she's like, oh my God, there's a story about it. It means I can go home. But this idea of folks stealing, whether that's stealing your senses or your physical belongings or actually stealing you away and spiriting you to another time and another place, seems to be, very common in these stories. So again, that idea of like magic and mystery, which kind of leads me on to another type of Cornish piskie. This one's a little bit more interesting, a little bit more controversial, a little bit more contested, really, because Bucca are associated, which is quite similar to the Welsh and Irish puca, very much. But these Cornish Bucca are very much associated with the sea. And in alternate stories, they're either a type of piskie, like very much like the Irish and Welsh puca, or the Bucca is some sort of sea god and sea deity. So the folklore, very regional folklore of Newlyn, says that Newlyn fishermen left offerings on the beach to the Bucca, a humanoid sea deity, a sort of man with seaweed hair, who would presumably like bless their next catch and look after the fishermen, maybe keeping them safe. But I'm not sure where that comes from. I'm not sure where the idea of the Bucca being a sea god really comes from, because you don't really find gods in Cornish folklore. We don't really have that kind of mythic pantheon of gods in the same way that you find in Ireland and to an extent in Wales as well. You don't really have kind of Cornish gods. So Bucca being a sea god, I'm not sure if that's quite a modern way of thinking, but yeah, it's quite interesting that Bucca is seen as either like a sea type piskie, a piskie associated with sea regions, or he is like a sort of sea god. But there is an established kind of queen of the piskies actually. So in a lot of the Celtic myths and legends surrounding fairies and other worlds, there's often mentioned a queen of the fairies. Well, that depends on who is telling the story. Some people seem to prefer there to be a king of the fairies, but there is often a fairy queen in these stories. Now, in Cornwall, in Cornish folklore, we have Joan the Wad, or Wad. I say Wad. I like Joan the Wad. I think it sounds good, but I'm not sure if it's supposed to be Wad. Anyway, she was said to be queen of the piskies and from Pobel. I don't know how old this folklore is, but in Diana Mullis's book West Country Fairies, she describes how Joan the Wad charms, the little piskie charms, these were incredibly popular when her father was a lad in the 30s, with hundreds being shipped out regularly all across the world. I don't always think it's important how old a bit of folklore is, really. I think new stories can be just as interesting, and so even as recent as the 30s, this idea of Joan the Wad and that lucky charm, piskie charm, being shipped out to all sorts of places in the world. I think that's really, really interesting. Now, Wad is Cornish for, I don't know if it's Cornish language or Cornish dialect for torch. So Joan the Wad, she's depicted with a torch in her hand. So the little piskie charms of Joan the Wad would have this sort of like feminine piskie form with a torch raised up in one hand. Now, she's a really interesting character because she sort of plays the role of Willow the Wisp, which again is a piece of folklore that you can find all around the world, that will-o'-the-wisp, or this bioluminescent light kind of bobbing over the moors and prairies and savannas and other types of landscapes like that. So Joan with her wad, with her torch, could often be seen as a light on the misty moors. So if you're walking around the misty moors of Cornwall and you see a light in the distance bobbing away, that could be Joan the ward with the torch in her hand. I've said it once and I'll say it again. Piskies and fairies are, say it with me, my friends, they are capricious. There's folklore of Joan leading travellers astray, and there's also folklore of her leading travellers to safety. So I'm not sure why she chooses to help some and why she chooses to hinder others, but I like to think if it's connected to that idea of mutual respect and gift giving. If you're being respectful of her moors, then perhaps she will be kind to you. And if you're being rude with bad manners and litter everywhere, then perhaps she's going to lead you astray. Which kind of brings me on to a really creepy story, actually. Me and my mum were on Gosmore a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago now. And it's a place I know very well. I go there all the time, not to out myself, but I take the dog there quite often. I'm very, very familiar with Gosmore and with the path that I was on. And I'm actually, despite my skitsy, crazy, ditzy, skitty brain, I'm actually very good at finding my way around. I'm pretty good at directions and following my feet. You know, if I've been somewhere a few times on a walk, I'm pretty good at finding my way around. So we had a bit of a combination of factors. One, it was dusk, and the dusk seemed to come in really, really quick, actually. The day was very quickly fading away and night was descending. 2, it was very muddy and we hadn't worn proper shoes, especially me. So I'd been stomping in the shrubbery and the bushes the whole walk. I'd spent very little time like walking in the actual path, which was just pure mud, and I just didn't have my wellies on or proper shoes. And I'd been making a little TikTok video about Joan the Wad and piskies. So I'd spent a lot of time that day talking about Cornish piskies and talking about Joan the Wad. And we were walking and everything was absolutely fine, and then suddenly it all seemed to change, and it was as though the path I know incredibly well, it just disappeared. It just didn't exist. It was so bizarre. Like I said, I know Gosmore so well, I know where I'm going, but it was like the path we needed to take just wasn't there, or it just skipped my brain. Now I know logically it's a number of factors. It was getting dark and all this other stuff, but yeah, it was like it just disappeared and we went down the wrong path, which was eerily similar, but it took us in completely the wrong direction and right into a swamp. We were kind of spiraling deeper and deeper into the moors, and then we reached this really boggy, swampy area. Now, turning back, I realised it was night. It was not daytime anymore, and I had to kind of make a very executive decision, actually. I was like, Mum, we are going through the swamp. And I decided to do this because I knew the railway ran alongside it, and if we somehow got ourselves like through the swamp and we somehow got ourselves over the barbed wire fence, then we could at least follow the rail tracks, which you're not supposed to do. That is trespassing, but this was an emergency, so please don't tell us off. This was years ago. But I knew that we could follow the rail tracks and get back to the car park where we were parked, which was directly next to the railway. So that's what we did. We managed to find our way through the swamp, and we found our way easily back to the car from there. But I'll never forget this kind of overwhelming feeling of unease. I don't know, because I know logically I know that we just set out a bit too late that day, and the darkness came, the night descended a little bit sooner. But because of all these factors, we'd gone for a wee at one point, you know, we were walking for ages and we'd gone for a wee in an old buildings, in an old, I don't know, is it an engine house or whatever. Not very ladylike, but we really were busting. So we we peed, we stomped around in the shrubbery, we were talking about piskies all day, and it just felt very odd. It felt very purposeful, this idea of us kind of being led astray. Yeah, it was very weird. I'll just never forget that feeling of it being deliberate somehow. And I had broken away from a much worse scenario of walking back further into the moors in the pitch black. If we hadn't kind of gone through the marsh and the bog and followed the rail track back to the car park. And dusk is really one of those strange liminal periods, isn't it? When the world, it's like a between worlds, isn't it? And that seems to be like very connected to the other world as well. It's possibly when the other world is at its thinnest, isn't it? These places of dusk and dawn, when night and day are kind of merging and blurring together. I've been back to Gosmore many times since. But sometimes I'm fine. Sometimes I go there and nothing happens. But I have had many spooky, strange encounters there. Actually, some of them quite horrible. The most horrible one was purely human and not supernatural. But I won't get into that because it was very nasty. But yeah, Gosmore's a very strange place and actually has lots of stories of being haunted. So yeah, that is sort of brings me to the end, really. Those are the Cornish piskies. Those are the Pobel Vean. You've got your standard piskie that lives on the moors. You've got your Cornish knockers. You've got your Spriggan. You've got your Pobel Vean. You've got your changelings. You've got all of these, Joan the Wad. You've got all of these different types of Cornish piskie stories. So I hope you enjoyed that. I certainly had a lot of fun recounting Cornish piskies. This might end up being one of my longest episodes, actually. Quite impressive. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. And we're getting it right at the end of February. So technically this is a February episode. So I've done an episode in January. I've done an episode in February. So if I can, I'd love to keep it up and do one every month. On that note, thank you to all of my patrons on Patreon. You guys help me out so much. So obviously when I'm not being very good and I don't upload monthly, I still pay monthly, and I still pay regularly to host the podcast. And I pay for other subscriptions, concerning the podcast. So the Patreon really helps me kind of balance out the price of it, really. And just, I'm not really making money on the podcast. I've never really made money on it. Would I love to? I mean, I'd love to. My dream would be that I get time and brain space and I regularly put out good quality episodes, of which this isn't one. This is just me rambling. But I regularly put out good quality episodes and I'm able to do that much more longer term. But yeah, that hasn't happened. And I don't expect that to. And I don't expect anyone to pay to listen to these episodes. So anyone that is a Patreon of mine, it is really, really, really appreciated. I've had a few new people actually in the last month or so. So I've had Madison Olsen. Sorry, Madison. I've had Madison Olsen. I've had Kate Schlussler. I'm sorry. Renelia Delgrange. I've had Eden Miller and I've had Amara Snivelly. I've probably butchered all of your names. I am so sorry. But thank you. So those have all been my patrons in the last 30 days. Thank you so much. It is so appreciated. But like I said, I don't expect any of you to sign up to my Patreon and give me any money. I don't expect it at all, but it's a lovely thing when I notice people are still signing up and being a Patreon. It really helps me out with the cost of hosting the podcast, and eventually maybe I can save up enough to work on some new equipment and all that sort of stuff, and spend more time researching and producing much higher quality stuff. So thank you very much. I now have 62 patrons on Patreon, which is absolutely incredible. Let's get it to 100, shall we? Come on guys, let's get it to That's very, very ambitious of me. I cannot believe 62 people have enjoyed this podcast enough that they decide to do that. But like I said, I don't expect it. And actually, thank you to anyone that's ever emailed me. Thank you to anyone that's ever sent me a message on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter. Many of you have. All of your messages are really, really, really appreciated. And emailed me. I love it. I'm so thankful to you. Thank you so much for anyone that's really engaged with this show enough that you want to tell me about it, or you want to strike up a conversation with me. I really appreciate it. It really touches me. I'm saying that very earnestly. It's really lovely, and I hope that we can continue to have these conversations, and I hope that many of you continue to get in contact with me. I'm sorry that it sometimes takes me a long time to get back to you, but I will eventually. I eventually will get back to all of your Facebook messages, your Instagrams, your Twitters, your emails. I will reply to you in the end, but just know that everything is very, very much appreciated. Thank you so much. Now on to my news, on to my good news. Any of you that have stayed this long, an hour, any of you that have stayed an hour into this podcast enough to hear my good news, you bloody angels. I could give you a big old smooch, a big old kiss. Thank you very, very much. So my news is that I have written a couple years ago, and I don't know if I ever mentioned it on the podcast. I probably did, I wrote a short audio comedy, so sort of like Alan Partridge and Piskies. I wrote a kind of loving tribute to community radio called Tregoint Community Radio, and it's a little 8-minute long snippet of a fictional community radio station set in a world where all of the folklore of Cornwall exists. Your mermaids, your piskies, your giants, they all exist, and it has been aired on BBC Radio 4 Extra. So I created it as part of a BBC Arts initiative called New Creatives. And it was for young people, and I was considered young then, which is absolutely great to me. This is a tangent. Do not ask people on the internet to guess your age. I did that on TikTok earlier. If you ever want to find me on TikTok, I'm Celtic_Sean. But my content it's not good. It's literally just me in my life, walking my dog, singing shanties, being silly. So it's not great. But if you ever want to follow me, my craziness on there, you're more than welcome to. And I did the silliest thing of asking people to guess my age. And of course, basically everyone guessed much, much, much older. Good fun indeed. God, that was a tangent. Where have I gone? Where am I? Where am I going? Tregoint Community Radio. That's it. So if you want to listen to it, it is on. That's what it was. New Creatives was for young people, and I was considered young at the time. How lovely is that? I think I got in I was a hair's breadth away from being an old hag. But I got in just at the end. Yes, but it was BBC Arts New Creatives initiative, and I'd never written a script before, and I had this a little crazy kernel of an idea for this. And I hadn't really sat with this idea for a long time. I've got some stories in my head that have been rattling around for years. I've got an epic fantasy book series that's just been rattling around in my head, and I haven't written it down on paper at all. And it's evolved with me as I've aged, and one day I'll bring it to fruition. But this was a very small kernel of an idea that I hadn't really sat with for a long time. And then I saw this opportunity, and I thought, oh bloody hell, why not? Let's just go for it. But it'd be a bit of a laugh, won't it? And then, of course, I got longlisted, and then I got shortlisted, and then I eventually got commissioned. So it was a really exciting process. I got to work with amazing actors, Ed Rowe and Mary Woodvine, who have both recently been in Mark Jenkins's Ennis Main. Very good Cornish film, and of course they were both in Bait, but they're actors in Cornwall that are just doing incredible work, and I was really lucky to work with them. And Simon Harvey, again, a really great person in Cornwall, doing amazing theatre, film, working on some really great projects in Cornwall. He was my mentor, so I was very lucky, and I got to write and record and create an 8-minute long short audio comedy piece. So So if you fancy Alan Partridge and Piskies, if you fancy listening to a loving tribute of community radio, then please, look it up on BBC Sounds. It's Tregoynt, Tregoynt, which I'm very proud actually does sound like it could be anywhere in Cornwall. It sounds like a real place in Cornwall. And I think it loosely translates to kind of strange place in the Cornish language. So I was quite happy with that. But Tregoynt Community Radio, and you can find it on there. Please give it a listen. I think it allows international listeners, BBC Sounds, I hope so. But please give it a listen. Let me know what you think. It was a lot of fun to create, and I hope that eventually I can create some more. So that's one piece of my good news. Another piece is that I'm going to be on TV soon. I led Jonathan Ross around some local woods. We went piskie hunting in some local woods. So yes, I can't really say too much because I'm not really sure what's happening yet. But there's going to be a new TV series on myths and legends, and I was part of it in a small way. Hopefully they haven't completely cut me out. Maybe they have. I do tangent a lot, but I might well be on TV talking about Cornish piskies very soon, and I will update my social media accounts with all the information when I have it. Thank you very much for your patience and bearing with me. This has been a very long episode for me. What has been my longest episode actually? I'm not sure, but this might be one of them. Might be one of the longest. Thank you so much for bearing with me. Thank you so much for continuing to listen, to support, to encourage this podcast, and long may I be recording it and carrying on with it. Now, my God, it's 11:05. I've been recording in real time. I'm very proud of myself. I am going to go to bed now. I'm going to put my skin stuff on, I'm going to put my pajamas on, I'm going to read my book, and I'm going to go to bed. Thank you very much, and I look forward to sharing stories with you all again soon at the end of March, because like I said, I'm going to do them every month. Yay! Bye everyone, thank you, until next time.